3CR Radiothon 2024. Sound on for solidarity.
Thanks for choosing a 3CR podcast. Throughout June, we're running our annual Radiothon, where we ask you, the listener, to make a donation so that we can continue to make great radio. Your donation will help keep us community-owned and community-controlled. Go to 3cr.org.au/donate, and with that done, please enjoy the podcast.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Satellite. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. My name is Joseph Toscano, and if you want to get in contact with me, you can always leave a message on 0439 395 489 or email me at info@pibci.net or info@anarchistmedia.org. So, plenty of things happening in the world today. So what we try to do on the Anarchist World This Week, and the key is try, T-R-Y, is to explain what's happening around the world in a maybe in a non-authoritarian way. A bit difficult sometimes. You wonder what anarchy is all about? It's not about chaos, anarchos without rulers. It's about creating a society without rulers. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people on a daily basis? Inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to share power, possibly through direct democratic means, the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Simple concepts that people have been striving for from time immemorial. Irrespective of your religious beliefs, or whether you've got no religious beliefs, irrespective of your gender, your sexual orientation, your culture, racial origin, the list goes on and on. The fact is, we are all oppressed through capitalism, a private investment for private profit, ideology, mantra, religion, Mammon. Now let's move on. Now, I assume you've got kiddies, or some of you have, and I assume some of you have got grandkids and you've got nieces and nephews if you haven't got kiddies. I mean, that's the way the world works these days, so it's always worked that way. And I'm a little bit concerned. Have you heard of the word Stirling? Have you heard of the word Tindall? Well, Stirling is in West Australia and Tindall is in North Queensland. So why are these two words causing me concern? Well, over the last 12 to 24 months, we've seen a number of strategic alliances which have been made, which has drawn us completely into the orbit of United States foreign policy. Completely. What little independence we had, we've lost. And how's that occurred? Well, Stirling in West Australia will now become a base for US nuclear submarines. Forget about the ones we're going to build or buy or whatever. But Stirling, West Australia, is now a US nuclear submarine base. And what about Tindall in North Queensland? Well, Tindall in North Queensland is going to become a US F-16 fighter jet base, okay? So what little sovereignty we had, we've given up completely. So why? Now, we have seen thousands of troops, US troops, being deployed in the Northern Territory in the last few years as part of this alliance. But why now? What's going on? Well, it's simple. It's simple. There's going to be an almighty ruckus between China and the US of A. Forget about the Ukraine and Russia. And we, through these alliances, are now part of the US military-industrial complex. Forget about Pine Gap, which has been there since the late 1960s. So the question is, which you need to look at, are you willing to sacrifice your children and grandchildren, nieces and nephews on the altar of Mammon? Are you willing? Because what are we fighting for? Will we be fighting for some type of egalitarian community? Will we be fighting for more freedom? Or like World War I, will we be asked to sacrifice young men and women on the altar of Mammon for a trade war, to ensure those who exercise power continue to exercise power, and those who acquire wealth continue to acquire wealth? As we see in the Middle East, and I'll speak about this later on in the program, it doesn't take very long for things to escalate. And those of you who are familiar with how World War I began, the fact that you had all these alliances in Europe at that particular point in time, a little spark when the Archduke of, Ferdinand, I think his name was assassinated by Serb nationalists, that the whole place burst into war. So we are playing a very dangerous game, and we're playing this very dangerous game because we have forgotten as a people and as a sovereign nation state that we are not in Europe, we are not in North America, but we are part of Asia. We have forgotten. And we think that if we hitch our wagon to the US wagon train, that they will protect us. The fact is, if you look at US history, US governments have only been interested in the US. Look at the disaster in Afghanistan. After 20 years, the Taliban overran Afghanistan within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Look at what happened in Vietnam. Look what happened wherever the USA has put its nose in. The fact is that we are being prepared. We are being prepared for a war that will have catastrophic consequences for us in Australia, because we are no longer that little isolated continent on the other side of the world. We are part of a complex global network that makes every major urban centre in this country a target. And if you want to see what modern warfare looks like and who the casualties are in modern warfare, look at what's happening in Gaza. You listen to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. Now, what's the difference? There's something I ask myself all the time when I see what's happening around the world. What's the difference between terrorism carried out by non-state actors and state terrorism. What's the difference? Is there any difference? I mean, terrorism is just defined in this country as using force or promoting force for political gain. Okay? Using or promoting force for political gain. So what is the state? What do we have? The state is able to exercise power and maintain the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication in the situation they find themselves in, because it has a monopoly on the use of power through the police, through private security, through the armed forces eventually. It has a monopoly on the use of violence. That's what the state is. It's an integrity that has a monopoly on the use of violence. You look around the world. So state terrorism is a really, shall I put it, state terrorism is a difficult force to confront. Because what we see is legislation being passed which allows the state in its various forms to impose its will on people through its monopoly on the use of violence. That's what state terrorism is. What we see in Gaza is state terrorism. What we see in Ukraine is state terrorism. I mean, they call it war. It's not war. It's terrorism. That's all it is. And you've got to remember that in 21st century society, it's not like the good old days, in inverted commas, where battles were fought by armies and people sat on the periphery and watched. 90% of casualties, as we see in Gaza, 95%, maybe even 99%, are civilians caught in the crossfire. So the thing about state terrorism, it's all-encompassing. A group that uses maybe terrorist means to promote its political agenda has a limited impact on society. When the state embarks on terrorism, a strategy of using terror to promote its political agenda, where it uses terror internally or beyond its borders, the impact is horrendous. Because what we see is people falling in behind their particular nation state, their rulers, their leaders, somehow believing they're getting involved will somehow protect them. In reality, it isn't. It doesn't protect you. The state doesn't protect you. What protects you is your relationship with the people around you. The people in your local region, the people beyond that local region, the ability to be able to share. That's right, horrible word, share in the fruits of that land. So what we're seeing around the world is a move to state terrorism. And the more authoritarian a government is, whether it's elected or self-appointed, the greater its ability to harness the power of the state to ensure that its aims, and only its aims, are what reigns supreme. Whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whether it's the USA, to a lesser degree Australia, whether it's Israel, I could go on and on. Whether it's Georgia at the minute. What we see is the state apparatus being used to ensure those who pull the strings continue to pull the strings. Now, this is nothing new. The state has used terror as a mechanism by which to control people for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The difference in the 21st century is that through education, through the fact that we can see what we can see, we're not just isolated in our little villages in the middle of nowhere, that we as a people should be agitating about the fact the state is becoming all-powerful. You listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia. The federal budget. Oh, God, sometimes I just feel sick. And look, the federal budget, I think it highlights the constraints under which governments work in this country. Now, the ALP-led government has attempted to ameliorate the condition of minorities in this country who are bearing the brunt of inflationary pressures. You know? A little bit this, a little bit of help with electricity bills, a little increase in rent subsidies, the 1 million of people who rely on rent subsidies to have a roof over their heads, a little bit here, a little bit there. And what does the reactionary media, the economic gurus, the experts, what are they all saying? Oh, it's inflationary. Inflation's going to increase. Well, let's not forget who's borne the pressure of inflation and why do we have inflation? Well, it's very simple. Have you seen corporate profits nosedive during this inflationary period? No. Because of their monopolies and duopolies, what we've seen is an increase in profits for these corporations, while people on limited income, whether it's a wage or a social security benefit, find themselves paying the price for these increased profits. Now, when the government of the day says, well, we're going to throw a few crumbs off the corporate table to assist people who are finding it the most difficult to deal with these inflationary pressures, we have the economists of this country, the conservative reactionary media, the government gilded ABC, throwing up their hands in horror about the fact that it may increase inflationary pressures. Well, obviously rent subsidies will increase inflationary pressures because landlords and landladies will say, oh, isn't this nice? Let's increase rents. The bastards have got $14 an extra a week. Let's take that $14 extra a week. Because you see, when there are inflationary pressures and interest rates rise, it's not the owners of property which take a hit. They pass on those increases in interest rates, increases in banking charges, increases in land tax to tenants. It's that simple. That's the nature of capitalism. Private investment for private profit. No profit, no company. Simple. So I think what the federal budget highlights is the constraints that governments work under in this country, irrespective of what colour they are. Green, red, blue, pink. It doesn't really matter. Because you see, real power does not lie in Parliament. It lies in the boardrooms of national and transnational corporations. It lies in the hands of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And nothing highlights this than the government's so-called response to the gas crisis and the opening up of the gas market. Nothing highlights this more than that. Because the fact is that governments in this country are constrained in terms of what they can do in order to assist those people who need government assistance to survive, let alone prosper. We see tens of billions of dollars, tens of billions, not the 9 billion which has been allocated to assist people who find themselves in difficult situations currently, but billions of dollars in corporate welfare. And what's corporate welfare? It's when government funds are given to the private sector to support the private sector. I mean, we see this constantly. We see this every day of the week. We see government funds, that's taxpayers' money, your money, my money, going to these private corporations. At the same time, we see our natural resources, the natural resources which belong to First Nations people and ourselves in this country, being given away, as we just seen with the gas industry, being given away to the private sector. No wonder there's never any money to deal with the inequalities which are growing in our society. And that's the key. Inequalities which are growing, which are causing immeasurable harm in society, not just in terms of economic harm, but in terms of mental anguish, in terms of physical illness, in terms of anxiety, in terms of stress, in terms of insecurity. And when you add the threat of a world war and the fact that we are now part and parcel of that network through the Stirling US base, the Darwin US base, the Tindall US base, you begin to understand the limitations. Now, it's not as if those who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication tap the government on the shoulder and say, this is what we want. What happens is that we as a people, that's right, you, me, listeners to the program, the billions of people who don't listen to the program, we accept the private investment for private profit mantra. We accept the idea that there is no other way. We accept that we need growth for growth's sake. We accept all these parameters because somehow, someday, we all think we're all going to strike it rich. Maybe we're all going to win the $100 million Powerball prize, which is up tomorrow, I think. We all think because we think in that way. We're thinking, we're programmed to think in that way. And what the 21st century has delivered, and the budget highlights this, is a nation of little investors, a nation whose future is tied up in the stock markets of the world through superannuation, a nation which has accepted the idea that privatisation and deregulation and corporatisation and globalisation will deliver the goods. And that's what we've been doing for the last 50 years, waiting for the goods to be delivered. A cargo cult mentality. And those of you who are not familiar with the idea of a cargo cult, it originated in Tanna in Vanuatu, which finds itself in a bit of a difficulty at the minute with but that's a different story. During World War II, when the local inhabitants saw all this cargo arrive, all these goods arrive in Tanna for the war effort, the US war effort, and a cult developed which believed, and in many ways they were right, that they were being denied this material that fell out of heaven. It's a little bit like manna from heaven, you know? Remember manna? No, unless you read the Old Testament, you remember manna. Remember when they crossed the Red Sea, the Israelites escaped from slavery in Egypt, although there's no records that they were slaves in Egypt, but that's a different story. Why, upset the apple cart by making myth reality and reality myth. When they arrived across the Red Sea, there was no food and God provided manna. An interesting concept, provided manna so they could survive. So manna from heaven. Cargo cult mentality. Here we are, we're all waiting. Privatisation is going to increase competition. Prices are going to get lower. And what happens? Prices become higher. All right, deregulation. Let's get rid of all those regulations. Red tape, green tape, blue tape, pink tape, yellow tape, you name it. Let's cut us free from regulation. Regulations were set up to protect people over generations of struggle. Did it deliver anything? No. And I can go on, which I'm not. But there are constraints. So all the federal budget can deliver is what the corporate sector doesn't want. We have a country where our natural resources are basically owned, exploited by private entities who pay, peppercorn royalties to us. And we rub our hands in glee when the price of iron ore goes up or the price for natural resources go up, because the peppercorn royalties we receive as a people will increase. Well, why shouldn't we, as a people, actually own, because we own the resources, theoretically, develop the resources and use them for our own benefit? Why do we have to continue down this pathway? I mean, this was supposed to be the workers' paradise in the 19th century. And then we've seen, over the last 50 years, during the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation tsunami, apologies for repetition, but that needs to be repeated over and over again, we are now reaping the benefits. So what are the benefits? Okay, what are the benefits? And again, unless we have major structural change, whether it comes through parliamentary means or pressure through extra-parliamentary means, through strikes, occupations, protests, demonstrations, is irrelevant. Because if Parliament can't deliver, we need to be able, as a people, to deliver. So what have been the byproducts? What are we harvesting? What are we harvesting? I think it's what are we harvesting? Remember the old biblical analogy? I seem to be, looking at old biblical analogies today. You sow seeds on barren ground, it doesn't grow. You sow seeds on half barren ground, you get stunted wheat. You got to sow seeds on good soil. So we've been sowing these seeds, and we've been waiting excitedly for them to grow, privatisation seeds, globalisation seeds, corporatisation seeds, deregulation seeds, thrown them out. And now we're sitting there and waiting, and we're thinking, what's going on? What's happening? Why do we find ourselves in this situation? 26 million people living on a continent. 26 million people. And we have private charities raising money to send Aussie kids to public schools. We have a debate about the fact the government at a federal level is more interested in giving money to rich private schools, and obviously there are poor private schools, but the rich private schools, instead of giving resources to the state sector. Then we hear stories about the health sector and the failures of the health sector because there aren't enough resources. For example, in Victoria, there aren't enough resources because they've been digging too many holes in the ground. They've been told, the various hospital boards, they've been told that if they go above their budget, the government's not going to bail them out. What does that mean? Longer waiting lists. Simple. Why do we find ourselves in this situation? I keep saying we're not Bangladesh, a country the size of Tasmania with over 120 million people. This is a continent, 26 million people. We can't even look after the needs, the basic, everyday needs of our people, and we wait for a budget to provide those, needs. But obviously, a budget which is framed in a capitalist framework will never be able to deliver. Never be able to deliver. And that's why we have the same stories week in and week out. Not enough money for education, not enough money for healthcare, not enough money for, to prevent family violence, not enough money for this. We've always got money to support the expansion of the, military-industrial complex. Always more than enough money to have some more, troops and police, but never enough money for anything. So in comes the Federal Treasurer, working with the Treasury, with the Reserve Bank, which is supposedly independent, coming up with this equation, a little bit here, a little bit there. I'm sorry, that's all we can do. And the so-called experts jump up and down because it may increase inflationary pressures. Inflationary pressures are mainly due to increased company profitability. Very simple. That's capitalist economics. And then we have that overwhelming housing crisis. Look, if you're wondering what you're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscane. I'm hosting today's program. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. If you've got to rush to the loo, well, relax. The program is podcast. If the neighbour next door knocks on your door because they need a cup of sugar for their meth lab, relax. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. All right, let's move. No, I don't want to move on from the federal budget because it's important. Because, see, budgets increase expectations. And it's a little bit like saying to the kids, if you've got kids or your nieces and nephews, saying, next year we're all going to go to Disneyland. They go, ooh, wonderful. Oh, wonderful. And you scrimp and save, and at the end of the year, you only got enough money to take them down to the beach for an ice cream. It's the same with a budget. It's the same concept. We expect that the budget somehow will make major alterations to people's lives. Now, the budget is constrained by the amount of income which comes into the Federal Treasury. Now, when we privatise government-owned assets, because they're not owned by the public, they're owned by the government of the day who sells them when they want to, because their ownership isn't incorporated in the Australian Constitution. They don't have to ask us to sell them. when they privatise a government-owned entity, what that means is the ability of that entity to make profits, and some of those profits to go into the Treasury, disappear. So that avenue has disappeared. We've privatised the ports, we've privatised the airports, we've privatised energy, we've privatised essential services, we've privatised the delivery of services, we've given it to the private sector. We've privatised parts of the public hospital sector, we've privatised parts of the public education sector, and I could go on for the next 24 hours about all the things that have been privatised in this country in the last 50 years. See, the thing about a public facility is the fact that it's there for everyone. I'll give you a simple example. Now, everybody's talking about the housing crisis, all right? We're all talking about the housing crisis. And, it's reasonable. Reasonable thing to talk about. Now, I listened to the budget. I've read the budget papers. And I never saw the word public housing. Now, maybe I missed it, but I never saw the word. I saw community housing, affordable housing, social housing, never the word public housing. Now, look, maybe I'm just an idiot, but, when you live in a society which is based on a private investment for private profit society, right, and you deliver this little budget, the fact is that there is no competition in a society where everything's been privatised, because you've got private entities theoretically competing against themselves. But what happens to these private entities? They get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they dominate the marketplace and set the political and parliamentary agenda. And that's what we see. So if you've got an economy which is dominated by the private sector and is fed, gorges on taxpayers' money, all you're doing is you're throwing money into a fire. Because ultimately, any profits that is made goes to the shareholders or the owners, and what the government gets in return, that's you and me. What we get in return is some taxation revenue because people are employed, and possibly a few royalties if it's in the mineral sector, the natural resources sector. So if the pot of money that you have access to continues to shrink, well, then you're not going to have the money at the end of the day to provide for these basic resources. And this pot continues to shrink. Because we have taxation laws which make the Australian taxation system dependent on wage earners. It's not dependent on the corporate sector. It's not dependent on royalties. It's not dependent on exploiting the resources that are around us. It's dependent on the tax which is paid by wage earners. Now, if globalisation and corporatisation and deregulation and privatisation were such wonderful things, you would think that people's lives would have improved over the last 50 years. Now, we may have more gadgets. I'm not denying we've got more bloody gadgets that you can poke a stick at. The fact is, we have more debt. And we have more of our resources being used to meet essential needs like food and shelter, healthcare, and fewer resources left to us at the end of the day. And again, so when you have a budget, if you don't have the structural changes to change, if you don't have the structural changes that address these issues, then nothing changes. Now, in Australia, where you have a media which is dominated that's right, dominated by a handful of private players and by an Australian Broadcasting Corporation which has been gelded by successive governments, then you have no mechanism via which to bring up different viewpoints, not just alternative viewpoints, but different viewpoints. It's all about maintaining the status quo. It's all about ensuring that those who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication continue to profit. It's all about the major corporations continuing to post record profits. It's all about privatising essential services like the aged care sector, early childhood development sector, the government providing services for people who are on social security benefits, and the list goes on. And the public housing issues is a perfect example. Instead of the government building housing, what we have is the government giving money to the private sector or giving titles to the community, social and affordable sector, which are private enterprises. Yesterday I was involved in a meeting, right, with somebody who'd organised a meeting of people from the social affordable community, residents. You know what the main problem is? Fear. Not one person wanted to be publicly identified. Fear. Fear they are going to be evicted. So the difference between social affordable, and so-called community housing and public housing is security. That everybody has an equal opportunity and you got security of tenure. So privatising the housing sector has been a total disaster. So we can continue to jump up and down, discuss the same issues week after week. Why do we have childhood poverty? Why do we have increasing, mental health issues? Why do we have increasing violence in the community? Why? And the fact is that unless we make major structural changes, which will require extra parliamentary activity, then nothing will change. You'll have the same headlines week after week, year after year, decade after decade, and we'll see more power and more wealth being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. All right, let's move on. As I said before, the budget, they did what they could with what they had. Unfortunately, without major structural changes, it will never be enough. Well, Gaza. Isn't that extraordinary? Carnage called war. Slaughter called war. That little stroll we're taking, where we're passing all the bodies, over 35 kilometres now. Mr Biden tuts while USA manufactured bombs keep raining down on Gaza. See, the Israelis ran out of bombs ages ago. Now, look, Kiev, all right, I think it's got about 2 million inhabitants, Ukraine's capital. If the Russians were doing to Kiev what Israel and the USA is doing to Gaza, the world would be up in arms. Instead of having debates about whether, you're anti-Semitic if you criticise the state of Israel, which seems to be the major debate which is going on in Australia today, why don't we look at the human misery and carnage which has been exacted by 2 million people living in Gaza for having the audacity, after over 70 years of occupation, to actually do something. I mean, you see, this situation, as I keep saying, didn't start on the 7th of October 2023. It started in 1948. And it's the civilians who are bearing the brunt of the carnage. I reckon of the 35,000 people that have been killed, they'd be lucky to have 1,000 militants being killed, Hamas militants. I mean, we were told the north of Gaza had been pacified, in inverted commas, bombed back to the Dark Ages. The fact is that, there are still resistance, Hamas resistance in the north of Gaza. I mean, this is an obscenity. What is happening in Gaza is an obscenity. I remember a few weeks ago I mentioned a woman who's, just lost family members in Israel bombing in Gaza, saying, what's the world doing? We're humans. We're not animals. The fact is that if I inflicted the same horrors on a group of dogs or a group of cats or even a group of rats, laboratory rats, I'd be indicted. But the world sits on its hands, waiting. I mean, this is horror. Horror. Hospitals being razed to the ground, people being summarily executed, whole tracts of land being devastated, children dying in their thousands, starvation being used as a weapon of war. We keep talking about anti-Semitism as if you're anti-Semitic because you're unhappy or protest against what's going on in Gaza, as if the Israeli state is all powerful and they can't be criticised. Let's see a few indictments from the International Criminal Court. Let's see something happen. Because ultimately, what is happening in Gaza is our responsibility. Because although our government is starting to make a few noises, the fact is it's not willing to break away from the USA. And that's the price we pay for not having an independent foreign policy. And those members of the Israeli Defence Forces who think they're going to eradicate Hamas, and those members of the Israeli Parliament who are now, little more than war criminals, need to understand that they are Hamas's best recruiters. You cannot destroy the ability for a people to aspire to their independence, whether it's in West Papua or whether it's in Palestine. You can destroy their militants, but all you're doing through this barbarity, and it's just barbarous what is occurring, is creating a new generation of militants who will make Hamas look like kindergarten kids. Because there is no military solution to wars of independence. There is no military solution. It doesn't matter how many people you think you kill and how long you can think you can subdue a population. And I think the Israeli population are beginning to understand, a small minority, are beginning to understand there is no military solution to the current situation in Gaza. And I think what this highlights, these atrocities highlights how powerless the United Nations really is. Powerless. While you've got the 5 security members being able to veto, something they don't like, and the rest of the Security Council is impotent. If China or Russia or the USA or France or Great Britain veto a proposal, well, that's the end of the proposal. All right, you're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia. Now, are you a whistleblower? Yeah, I like to blow whistles. That was pathetic, wasn't it? Well, whistleblowers, Australian whistleblowers, do not pass go. Go directly to jail. Now, yesterday we had a very interesting court case come to an end. The David McBride court case. David McBride was a lawyer in the Australian Defence Forces, and he wasn't happy with what he was seeing coming across his table. And he complained to the military brass, and he complained to this person, and he complained to that person. He tried to go up the right channels to highlight what was happening in Afghanistan as far as the Australian troops was concerned, and every turn he took, he was blocked. Okay? Block, block, block. Not our business. Go down the road. You know what it's like when you complain to a government authority. You know, they give you 15 options, which all are dead ends. So poor old David decided to do what he thought was the honourable thing, and he leaked some documents, so-called classified documents, to the press. The press had a field day, won a few Walkleys, you know, put out some programs, and David's left holding the baby. That's right. Charged. He was charged with, you know, whatever he was charged with, you know, secret bullshit. None of the reporters were charged. Didn't have the guts to charge the reporters. But he was charged, and after a long court case, he decided to plead guilty. He had enough of this bullshit, which has destroyed his life. And the ACT Supreme Court sentenced him to 5 years and 8 months in jail, which he would have to serve, I think, 2 years and 3 months. And that was, you know, he was supposedly leaked confidential documents. You know, we saw this with the East Timor and the oil crap, where they leaked confidential documents. And he got 5 years and 8 months jail. Now, we're supposed to have in this country whistleblower protection legislation. So if, you know, you blow the whistle, say like they did on the Commonwealth Bank, and they had to have a Royal Commission, or the aged care sector, and you had an aged care Royal Commission, you blow the whistle. You need somebody with some ethical compass, somebody who thinks morality is still important, to actually say, this isn't right. This needs to be put right. This needs to be exposed. It means I'm going to take a risk. And they take a risk, and what happens? For exposing the truth, as Mr. Assange knows, you get jailed. It doesn't just happen in the US of A. It doesn't happen in Russia. It doesn't happen in China. Not just in all those countries where it happens on a regular basis, but it's now happening in this country, where even the defence lawyers couldn't actually look at the material because it was classified. All right. You've been listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is being streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. And just in case you think The Anarchist World This Week is a free lunch, think again. On the 12th of June is the Radiothon, and we need money to keep this program on air. We need money for the community radio station this program comes from, which is 3CR in Melbourne, because it's the only radio station in Australia that doesn't rely totally, it doesn't rely on government, you know, support. It doesn't rely on the private sector. It doesn't have private, advertising. And that's what allows me to say what I say on The Anarchist World This Week. So if you're a regular listener, think about the Radiothon. Every donation over $2 is a legitimate legal tax deduction. Do what the rich and infamous do. Give to Community Radio 3CR and get a legal legitimate tax deduction for listening to The Anarchist World This Week. What a delicious irony. You could talk about it forever at the next dinner party you have. Thank you once again for listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station. Don't forget, regular listeners, tonight, the 15th of May, Footscray Hotel, 48 Hopkins Street. I'll be talking about swingers, not the ones you think about, but the swingers from the Peasant Revolt of 1830. Listen to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station next week. Listen to the podcast, 3cr.org.au, Anarchist World this week.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to the Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
3CR Radiothon 2024. Sound on for solidarity.
You've been listening to a podcast produced at 3CR Community Radio. It's Radiothon time. This year, we need to raise $275,000 to keep the station going. Any amount you can afford makes a big difference. It's so easy to donate. Head to 3cr.org.au/donate. We rely on the community support. Thanks for listening.